Hey everybody, so in this video I'm going to talk about 6 reasons for the power of logical notation in fast piano progress. This is what the notation actually... So we have these areas with square brackets, we have some with curly brackets. This is the actual music of one of my amazing students. He started from total beginner at the age of 66 not that long ago, and he's doing really well. And on this channel, I hope to share with you strategies, mindsets, methods, etc., often of my own creation, that I hope will help you in your piano playing, hopefully even other areas of your life as well. So I'll just explain in brief what the logical notation is and what it means, and then I'll go into the 6 reasons for why it is so powerful and effective, because there's a lot of other videos on the channel that explain in more detail. But basically, if you have curly brackets, this is referring to both hands. If you have square brackets, this is referring to separate hands, and it allows you to keep track of the work that you've done so far. So for instance, here we have a half inside of here. So this means half of a measure, and we always include the next beat or note as well too. So because we have these curly brackets, it means the students played half a measure plus the next note or chord from memory and to the quality that we want, which is, let's just say it's a pretty good or high level quality. So then after they've done it just one time, then they'll notate, or one of us will notate that here. And these square brackets, it refers to separate hands. Obviously this is a review for any of you who've been following along with the channel, but for anybody that's new, so this would mean you've practiced a quarter of a measure, and we always include the next note as well too. This would mean just for right hand. And then here we have half. This means that we've done half a measure plus the next note from memory and to a high quality, and then we'll mark a half in square brackets, and this keeps track for the left hand. So that's some explanation at a high level of what it means, and that is the first reason why it's powerful for fast piano progress. It allows us to keep track of the work. It allows the student to keep track of the work and remember what they've done so far, because once you accept the premise like, oh, it's a good idea for me to remember that I've practiced these tiny little fragments. We practice these tiny little fragments because it's too hard to do the entire measure all at once, right? This student could not have played both hands this entire measure all at once. But what he is able to do is practice sometimes even halves or even quarters of a measure, and in the beginning, not even both hands, only separate hands. But how can he remember everything that he's done? So it's not enough to break things down smaller than really anyone else is willing to go. It's just as important for us to remember all of those tiny little micro decisions that we've made. And so the student can then look at the music afterwards and see like, oh yeah, I actually practiced specifically quarters of a measure here, halves of a measure over here. I think if we look back for 1 second, so literally you'll be able to see like, oh, I practiced like a quarter measure plus the next note here. I practiced a quarter measure plus the next chord here. And conversely, I've done half a measure plus the next note in the left hand here. And again, over here, I've done half a measure plus the next chord with both hands. So there's really no other very easy way to keep track of everything without writing things down. And this also allows the student to keep track of areas that they haven't done. So a lot of the time students will start from the beginning of the piece, they will encounter some difficult area, and then they'll say like, oh, David, I only practiced the first 2 measures because I found this thing I didn't understand. So then I just, replayed the first 2 measures over and over again. And I would say, oh, why not just skip over that tiny fragment you don't understand and then just keep going? And the person often didn't even realize that they could do that if they're newer and studying with me for the first time. So this way, there's no excuse for not doing what you can do. You don't have to, there's no excuse for getting stopped cold in your tracks just because you've encountered one thing that you don't understand. You can just skip that and keep going and do the things that you can do. So let's say you solve little quarters of a measure, you do little quarters of a measure correctly, you mark them, notate them correctly, and then you encounter that one tiny area, just skip it, go on to the next quarters of a measure, go on to the next line, and then the music with the notation will keep track for you all the parts that you have and haven't done. You can always go back to those trickier parts, whether on your own or in the next lesson with the teacher. So And as mentioned earlier, you can keep track of extremely intricate details and tiny little minute differences using this notation. So that's the first reason, just keeping track of work so specifically, even if the granularity is extreme, and keeping track of all the things that you haven't done as well too. And second reason is instant communication with me of a huge amount of information, or it could be with another teacher that understands these strategies. So when the student practices on their own, this happens to be work that we did together in the lesson, I think some of this, but often the student will update markings, and then I'll say like, hey, student, could you send over your markings if you made updates? And they'll send this over, and I instantly know every single tiny little decision that the person thinks that they've made. Or they did make them perhaps, but we don't know if they're all to quality. But at least I know like, okay, this person believes that they've done all of these tiny little sections well. He's done quarter measure sets, which is again quarter of a measure plus the next note, quarter of a measure plus the next note, through all of this area, and he's done a half measure set, half a measure plus the next note in the right hand here, and he's done left hand half measure sets, from here to here, here to here, here to here, as evidenced by the green. And he also has done quarter measure both hand sets, for instance, from here to here, quarter of a measure plus the next note, quarter of a measure plus the next note, quarter of a measure plus the next note, quarter of a measure plus the next chord over here. And he also thinks he's done half measure sets, half a measure plus the next note, half a measure plus the next note. But I don't have to like say all of these things to myself. I can just look at the music, and I pretty much instantly know all of these micro decisions. So it's a tremendous amount of extremely specific information delivered in a very concise, elegant way. So that's the second reason. It saves so much time. There's no more of this, oh, I think I practiced separate hands. I think I practiced this part a little bit more. The information is much more specific, and it's delivered much more quickly as well too. So then I, as the teacher, or whoever's reviewing this student's progress, we would now be able to not needlessly take up lesson time just to have all this back and forth. We don't need all of the what they think happened, because they've actually notated it. And the third reason would be this idea of distributed cognition. And I love this idea of an external mind or external brain. And I have another video on this. I think it's just called Distributed Cognition and Fast Piano Progress or something like that. And I cannot take credit for this idea. This was something that I learned from reading David Allen, and a lot of you might know this book, Getting Things Done, Art of Stress-Free Productivity by David Allen. And I also read this, Making It All Work, and I actually thought this was also fantastic. And not for the reasons you might think, because this is talked about in a lot of business and productivity circles. There are some diehard advocates that have implemented David Allen's entire Getting Things Done or GTD system. Ironically, I actually have not implemented that system in such great depth, but I think that there are some larger philosophical ideas that he's expressed that have really resonated with me. So I've used aspects of his system, but it just goes to show when you learn something that you can take bits and pieces from it, and it can totally transform your approach either to piano or even for totally different things, and you don't have to implement absolutely everything exactly as is. So this idea of distributed cognition, of we only have a limited amount of brain space, and humans are naturally not good at remembering things. Like if I ask you to get 30 items from the grocery store and you don't write it down, you likely cannot remember that you're supposed to get eggs and bread and what else is it that you told me to get. As soon as you write the things down on a grocery list, what humans are great at is making all these connections between different things. Like, oh, I have this grocery list, I also have my calendar, I also have my organizational system, and I can see that I would be able to get the groceries at this time, and actually that reminds me I can also do this, and that gives me the idea for this project. And so we're great at becoming creative and innovative once we've freed up that brain space, where originally we were just struggling to remember the things, but because we've created this external mind or brain, the grocery list or whatever else we've written down, that's now freed up our higher order cognitive functions so that we can use more advanced strategy, more advanced decision making. So that's a big part, or one of the big ideas that David Allen posits, and I love the way that he thinks about this, because I honestly had not thought about it in that way before. I'd always naturally written like all the fingerings, and also now with my logical notation, I've kept track of all these tiny little areas in my students' music and in my own music. But what I hadn't really realized until I read these books, or read those books, is that it really frees up your mind for higher order strategy. And you guys can also search David Chang 14 Layers of Strategy, or look at the playlist on my channel if you want to see much more intricate examples that I won't have time to go into here. But basically, because these are written out, I'm able to not only keep track of everything, but also because I don't need to use my brain to think like, oh, what is it that I did again? I can see like, oh, I did right hand quarter measure sets here where that student did. And this gives me an opportunity, like I can see that I could combine these together into a half measure set. So if I did that, I would erase these and then write half if I were able to play right hand from there to there, for instance. Or I might say like, oh, left hand, we've got 2 half measure sets here, right, from here to here and here to here. I can see an opportunity to use rule of expansion, which is one of the other principles in my method. I can combine it into like a 1 measure left hand set, for example. Or I might see that maybe there's not an example of it right now, but sometimes if I see, for example, like a 1 measure right hand set, 1 measure left hand set, I might say like, oh, this is a good opportunity to transition into both hands using my rule of transition. So I have various other strategic ideas where if you search like David Chang rule of transition, David Chang rule of expansion, or you watch my like little 14 layers of strategy series on my channel, you'll see some other more specific ideas. But point being that when I see these markings on the page, I can see opportunities. I can see that because there's 2 quarter measure fragments on the right hand next to each other of the same type, that there's a chance to combine them into a half. And the idea occurs to me almost instantly because it's just so visual and it's already there on the page. I might also scan, like I could go back to page 1. I could go to, actually, let's just go ahead and do that. So let's say we go back to page 1 here, and we see that there's a half measure set. So, and this is both hands because it's the curly brackets. Both hands this student has done from here all the way to there, here all the way to there. And so I can also see a chance to combine these together into a 1 measure both hand set using my rule of expansion. And it's okay if you don't totally understand what that means at this point, but it just means that it's easier to see opportunities. And you can see that there's kind of higher level decisions that we can make here. If we want to, we could be doing separate hand sets. We could be combining these small areas, just separate hands on the frontier, or maybe because the first page is more familiar, we already have both hand segments. We can be combining both hand sections on the first page, which is a pretty different type of problem solving. So let's say that it takes me less energy to solve separate hand sets, which means just combining separate hand segments or looking at new separate hand segments and doing this coordination for the first time. So either it's for the first time or you're combining old ones into something that's larger. If it takes less energy to do separate hands, then if I feel tired, I can do more separate hand segments on the frontier. If I feel like I have a lot of energy, I feel like I can conquer the world, then, or it's like the very beginning of the day, I just had coffee, I have a lot of energy, then I can go to the both hand segments. Maybe those take me more energy and effort. And so depending on my energy level, I can go to the thing that takes more or less energy as appropriate. So because we have this distributed cognition idea, everything's already notated there, it makes it easy for me to assess and weigh the different pros and cons of each opportunity. And there's art in this too. I think that there's artistic creativity and innovation in your decision making here. I'm sure I can make another longer video about this idea in the future. So far we've had that it allows the student to keep track of all of the work in minute detail. That was the first reason. It's also instant communication with me or with others, other teachers or other people of a huge amount of information. We have this idea of distributed cognition. It frees up the brain space because it's already notated here so that we can use higher order strategy and see opportunities and different types of opportunities much more easily. We can begin to utilize strategic thinking, honestly, I think even as an art form, because we're able to conceive of higher order, more interesting ideas because we're able to weigh more complicated opportunities. And the fourth reason I would say would be just this idea of small wins that has been talked about a lot in the habit research. So, I mean, when you do a tiny little section, let's say it's a quarter measure right hand set, which would be a quarter of a measure plus the next note, you do that correctly, even if it's 3 notes, and then you can notate in square brackets using my notation, like 1/4, and you use the little square brackets. That hopefully makes you feel like you've done something, as opposed to you're like playing both hands, or you're playing a section that's too large, and after you've practiced for like 30 minutes or an hour, you're honestly not even sure if it's gotten that much better. And it might not have, because you've played it messily and slowly and hesitantly. And instead, if you do tiny little sections, and happens that you can do them to a far higher quality because it's not something that's too difficult for you right now, even total beginners, they normally do not, on average, have nearly as much trouble playing just 3 notes or 5 notes. So by doing this tiny little part, notating it in, we psychologically feel a lot better too. And also literally it is better for your learning progress, it so happens, because you've done a small section to quality as opposed to a large section poorly. So you've recorded these like perfect little coordinations, but also psychologically you feel good because you've done something specific. You can see the visual evidence in front of you. And so often our brains will treat that as a small win. And then we're like, okay, well, that's good. Let me go to the next quarter measure set with right hand alone. Okay, I've done that. And then I mark again another quarter. And then, all right, that felt pretty good too. And then at the end of your session, you can look and see like 8 of these tiny little markings. And you can say to yourself like, okay, well, I actually was able to complete something. So this fourth thing, the small wins, as opposed to this large thing that we're not sure of. And so it's psychologically building up momentum. It ties into the fifth reason why the logical notation is so powerful in fast piano progress, which is this, it really is accountability as well too, both to yourself and to your teacher if you have one. So a lot of the time what I find, especially with newer students, I teach this general idea, people understand the premise, maybe in the lesson or in whatever program that we're in, the person's able to solve maybe like 10 or 12 sets. And when I say solve, it just means that they've played a certain section to as high quality as they can muster at that time. So maybe they will do, let's say like 10 quarter measure separate hand sets, which again is any section plus the next note. And I'm like, okay, cool. So how much are you going to practice over the next week? And let's say that the person's unusually diligent and they even practice like 45 minutes a day or something. The next week they may come back and they've marked only like 4 markings or 5 markings the entire week. And I would say like, oh, you know, were you able to practice as much as you said that you were going to be able to? And let's say the person's answer was yes. Well, then I have to ask them, well, what specifically did you do with all of that time? And sometimes the person, and I'm not judging them for this, but they will sheepishly say that they don't really know where the time went. And so I would say that when you're practicing, you should see, if you're following this system and you understand the premise, you should see a lot of markings or a decent amount of markings after your practice. So if I'd say 5 to 7 minutes is a good general rule of thumb in terms of an upper limit for how long these very small sets take. So if it's taking you 25 minutes to do a given thing, that's probably too hard for you at this moment. It's not the most efficient thing that you could do. Whereas maybe if you play just 3 notes or 5 notes, let's say you're a beginner or total beginner, maybe that would take you 3 minutes, or maybe it'll take you 6 minutes or something. And after you've practiced, let's say you practice for like half an hour, maybe let's say you have like 5 little markings. So you did like 5 little tiny sections to quality from memory. Don't worry about remembering them because it'll go through spaced repetition. You can search David Chang spaced repetition or watch the other stuff that I said, 14 layers of strategy, if you want to know more details. But basically at the end of your half hour, you should look at your page and be held accountable to what it is that you see. Oh, I see 5 new markings, and so that means that I've done something specific and I can see it. I literally can see what it is that I've done. And then the next day, I would actually say for newer students, don't even worry about linking those together because we don't have evidence you can do that yet. I'll teach you that next time, how to use rule of expansion, rule of transition, etc. Instead, just do 5 new markings somewhere else. And if you do this and you practice, let's say 5 6 days, you should have 25 or 30 new markings to show me. So then you're accountable to me, or you're accountable to the teacher that you're playing for, or to whoever you're talking to. And if you're a little more advanced, you actually understand how to combine the quarters into halves, or halves into ones, or how to transition using a rule of transition from separate hands to both hands. You can do that too, but then at the end of your practice session, you should see like, oh yeah, I combined these quarters into a half, and I combined these quarters into a half, and I've ended up with, let's say, 5 new half measure set markings. Like my practice session was about combining, and I can see that. I can see that there's 5 new half measure sets that I've each combined together on their own. So that keeps you held accountable again to yourself and to whatever teacher that you're playing for as well too. And finally, the 6th reason for the power of logical notation of fast piano progress, it really is broadly being able to play something that should have been impossible for you otherwise at this time. And the student that I talked about, this anonymous student who started at age 66, actually just turned 67 recently, love working with him. Really, all the time I spend with him each week is very joyful, very fun lesson. And under traditional means, he should not have been able to play Canon in D and start playing it both hands. Even some of the sections that you've seen, he's done actually really well with linking some of this together. He can play the first page from memory and into some of the second page as well too, and we're making really good. We actually haven't worked together even that long. I think it's been a few months. So yeah, so it's been recent, and the notation is what made it possible, and it's because of all those other things that I said. So you keep track of the work, he's held accountable, we see these higher level opportunities and so on. And so whereas in traditional means, any other, or not any other, but almost any other teacher probably would have said like, well, we've got to, of course, take him through beginner books for years and go through like level 1 and then level 2 and have him do scales and other exercises and things. Instead, we were able to directly work on this piece that he really enjoys and get him this amazing progress. And I won't go on and on about this for too long, as it's not the main point of this video, but often people will ask like, well, what about all of the other things? I mean, he's learned a ton of music theory, from how to read notes, how to read, play the black keys, from literally doing the piece itself. He's acquired a level of coordination that really would not normally have been possible by going traditionally through a beginner book, or even doing like scales and things, because this piece, there's different coordinations and everything going on. And then later, if we want to circle back around, and we probably will, could be, further on down the line, his brain will be way more optimized for how to dive deeper into theory, how to dive deeper into scales, etc., because he's just flat out more coordinated, and he understands how to think and how to learn from the application of these strategies. So I'm taking really the long-term view, and instead of cutting corners, we're seeing that the level of coordination, the level of technique, the level of understanding of the music is actually much further along than it would have been had we gone by traditional means. So again, 6 reasons for power of logical notation: allows a student to keep track of the work, instant communication with me or other teachers of a huge amount of information, this idea of distributed cognition, freeing up your mind for higher order strategy and opportunities, along with the habit research showing that we usually will feel more motivated from small wins. 5th reason, that it's an accountability system for the student and for, to present to the teacher or to lessons if they are in lessons. And all of that really leading to the 6th reason, which is allowing for the learning of pieces that probably wouldn't have been possible otherwise. So hope this was interesting to you. Some of these ideas actually are relatively newer. I started giving this little lecture recently, and so I thought it'd be good to make a video. Let me know what other questions you have. What do you have other reasons, or are you curious about anything that I've talked about? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this valuable, please like, subscribe, let people know about the channel, and looking forward to the next one.